My name is Brian Kittler, and I am the Vice President of Forest Restoration here at American Forests. At American Forests and our Forest Resilience Program, we have a very strong focus on wildfire. Wildfire, as you all know, is a significant issue facing many of our forest lands in the United States, specifically in the Western US. In those landscapes hardest hit by wildfire, we are bringing proactive climate-adapted restoration to the ground through partnerships like we're going to be talking about here today. So it's my honor to welcome you to this event, and we want to keep this as interactive as we can in this virtual space. So please, again, as you have questions come up, please enter them in the Q&A. We'll be answering those in real time, and also at the end of this panel discussion. So I want to welcome you to this event. You're going to hear firsthand accounts of how climate change and wildfire are affecting both Western forests and Western communities. You're also going to hear some inspiration. You're going to hear inspiration in the voices of the people working on the ground to form partnerships to respond to the wildfire crisis and to the climate crisis. So where to begin? Well, let's start right at the beginning. It's been another hot and dry summer here in the Western United States. I'm based on the West Coast, as are my three colleagues that I'm going to be introducing here in a minute. So when we talk about wildfire and climate change as a crisis, it's important to really just stop and think about that word crisis for a minute. As we're approaching this, wildfire, yeah, we are seeing signs that we are entering a crisis phase, but we must approach the issue understanding that wildfire is a natural process within our forest ecosystems. Our forests have co-evolved with fire. And globally, we've got an amazing diversity of forests. And it's hard to sort of categorize them any number of ways, but for sake of this presentation, I'm going to lump them into two big buckets. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first big bucket with regards to our forest wildfire question is the cool, moist forest. So these are places like this temperate rainforest, which is actually an hour west of where I'm sitting right now in the Northwest Oregon Coast Range. It has really, really high carbon volumes. It has really, really dense forests that are adapted to long periods between when fire comes back. So you have a lot of growth in the forest for a couple hundred years, high biomass volumes, high carbon volumes. So that's sort of our first type. And we see this in other places where forest intervals are fairly infrequent. And when forest fire comes, it burns up most, if not all, of the vegetation. Next slide, please. So the second bucket that I want to talk about are dry forests. So these are forests that are generally less carbon volume, less trees, less biomass. And when fire occurs, it occurs frequently and generally at the surface. So we're seeing grasses that like to carry the flames. The fire doesn't generally get up into the canopy as much, and as a natural process, it is rejuvenating both the understory and also releasing new seed in many places through a process called serotiny. So this is just some of the adaptations that our forest systems have for actually having fire as a natural and essential process in many of our forests. So I just think it's a really important place for us to start, because a lot of the forest restoration work that we are trying to do is to enable and allow for quote unquote good fire to return back to the landscape. Next slide, please. And so given that this is Climate Week, I also just want to touch on the fact that yes, forests are climate solutions. Here in the US, about 17% of our total greenhouse gas emissions from all sources are actually offset on an annual basis by America's forests and our wood products. Globally, forests are both a sink and a source of emissions. So deforestation, typically in the tropics, when we think about it, deforestation accounts for 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions currently entering the atmosphere in any given year. And what we're seeing with climate change, it's sort of this feedback loop where more climate change begets more wildfire, more drought, more forest mortality, which is actually also emitting more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. So we're slowly chipping away at that forest carbon sink over time. Next slide, please. In fact, in the last 20 years, about 26 to 29% of all global forest canopy loss was due to fire. And roughly about a third of all the emissions from deforestation can be attributed to wildfire. So about 20% of all emissions from all sources globally is from deforestation, and a third of that is from fire. And as I was saying before about the trajectory that we're on with global warming and climate change, if we hit 2 degrees Celsius, we're going to potentially see a significant increase in wildfire activity and weather, which will allow for wildfire to spread. So just contextually, it's really, really important to understand kind of where we're at right now in 2022 and potentially where we could be at the end of the century. So the UN just came out with this report citing a potential for a global average increase of wildfire activity by about 57%. So when we think about the climate change and the climate that we're growing into, it's important to recognize that we're going to have a lot more fire in the future, and we do have some choices to make about what type of fire we want to have. So another real concern of my organization and folks working in forestry, particularly in the Western US, is trends that we're seeing related to forest loss, forest canopy loss, but then also lack of regeneration following wildfire. Next slide, please. All right, so here in the US, I talked about our global trends, and here in the US, we're definitely seeing a significant increase in both the spread of wildfire, the amount of fire in any given year on the landscape, but then also the amount of wildfire that burns so intensely that largely most of the trees die in the fire, and we're not seeing sort of that natural resilience and regeneration occurring like we would like to see and expect normally in a low or moderate severity wildfire. So in the last few decades, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of high severity fire. These are large tree killing wildfires, oftentimes increasing in large patches. And actually in California, in just the last 2 years, about 5% of all California's forest land has burned in high severity wildfires. What happens in those areas? We're going to get into that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So why are these trends happening? Again, we can point to climate change, certainly. There's data and science that shows that, but it's also due to a legacy of some decisions that we made as a society. We didn't understand fire. We didn't understand it as the natural process, and therefore we excluded it from the landscape. We chose through policy and through just natural human society to exclude wildfire as a natural process. So as a consequence, we're now dealing with a legacy of some pretty unhealthy forests in a lot of the Western US. The map here on the left shows about 55 million acres of forests that is considered to be unhealthy. And this is national forests, federal public forest, that is at risk of the type of wildfire that we really do not want to see. It's also at risk of mortality due to drought, which is another significant consideration. In fact, we are in the worst mega drought that we've had in 1,200 years here in the Western US. The graph here on the right depicts the amount. It's essentially a metric of fuel aridity, which is the readiness of forest vegetation to burn. The graph is attributing about a twofold increase in the amount of fuel aridity due to anthropogenic climate change. So by human-caused climate change, we've made our forests that much more dry and that much more ready to burn. So with these two factors, excluding fire, a buildup of fuel in the forest, and climate change drying our forests out, you get the situation that we're now experiencing and living through. Next slide, please. So the path forward, what can we do about this crisis? Certainly, the number one thing we can do is to try to break that feedback loop between climate change and increased fuel aridity by reducing our emissions. We have to reduce our emissions if we are going to save our forests. I think the other thing that we need to do is recognize that this situation, this emergency, is sort of a year-round situation. Generally, as a society, we've gotten into the habit of just thinking about wildfire as a season. It's only in the summer. We're only thinking about suppressing those fires. We're not thinking about proactively working before the fires, before ignitions, to make those forests more resilient. And we have lots of cases now on the ground with experience in the field where proactive thinning and reintroduction of low severity prescribed fire can make our forests more resilient to wildfires when they inevitably are going to happen. So really ramping up that pre-fire work has to be a part of the solution. We also have to be looking at post-fire. A lot of these landscapes are going to continue to be heavily impacted, and it's going to take a significant dedication of resources, expertise, and workforce to bring our forest back. Next slide, please. So the path forward, I'm really excited with some new policies coming out of the Congress, this particular Congress. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the largest climate bill ever for any country. And we also have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So these two pieces of policy are the largest investment in America's forests ever. And they're certainly the largest investments in climate smart forestry. So positively, with regards to wildfire, the biggest chunk of funding out of these two bills is going into fuel reduction work. It's going into forest resilience treatments. And we're also seeing more money than ever before building up the capacity to do the post-fire restoration. So it's a really, really exciting moment. And what I'm most excited about is that this money is going to be used by some amazing people on the ground who are adapting their techniques, are developing science-based approaches, and are getting the restoration work done. So we have 3 of them here today, and I'm excited to turn it over to them just to tell us a little bit more about this work and about the moment that we're living through with forests and wildfire in the United States, in particular here on the West Coast. So I'd like to introduce Britta Dyer, Ryan Tompkins, and Amy Marcus. Britta is American Forest's Senior Director of California and the Pacific Islands. Britta is based in the Central Sierra Nevada. She's been working in forest resilience in the Sierras since 2009. She leads our restoration programs in California and has developed an amazing team that is doing some incredible work, place-based work with partnerships across the state. Ryan is a cooperative extension forester with the University of California. His research interests include forests and fire ecology and forest management, specifically in the Sierra Nevada. He has a background in silviculture. He had an 18-year federal career with the United States Forest Service. Really excited to have Ryan here to talk about his work in the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force, working with Britta in developing a post-fire restoration strategy for the state of California. And lastly, we have Amy Marcus. Amy is a cohesive strategy coordinator for the Fremont-Wainema National Forest in South Central Oregon. Amy has been working in the past year with American Forest to help develop an all lands post-fire restoration strategy for her community, and has just led amazing collaborative partnerships over many, many years in that region for both pre-fire work and now for this post-fire work that's really, really needed in that landscape. So without further ado, I want to turn over to Britta Dyer to lead off the discussion about California.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you're at. Can we just do a quick mic check? Can everyone see me okay? Can you hear me? Thumbs up, Brian?
Oh, good.
Great, thank you. Hey, I'm so excited to chat with you guys today about how it is that a multitude of change agents across California are truly being able to dive in and try to transform these landscapes, right? These lunar landscapes into lush forest once again. But in order to do that, what I'd like to do first is just ground you down into the essence of what is California at this moment in time. So next slide, please. California ownership. Do we own her? I'm not sure, but this is how it breaks down at this time. There's 33 million acres of forested land across the state. 60% is publicly owned. 13% is privately owned by industry, and then 27% is actually comprised of tribal lands and small landowners. So now we'll take this and actually compare that to what it looks like from a wildfire perspective in the last few years. Next slide, please. It can speak for itself, right? Look, what you want to know here is that since 2019, 5 million forested acres have burned. 5 million, right? And this spiked in 2019 for all the reasons that Brian outlined earlier in and around climate change, but also due to the management, right? Or how Homo sapiens have managed or mismanaged the forest to date. Go ahead and flip to the next slide. I just want you to really digest. It's the same information actually that you just saw in the last slide, but in a different way, depending on your Myers-Briggs, how you digest things. This is a table that CAL FIRE puts out every year, and it outlines the largest California fires throughout history, the top 20, right? And what is interesting, they've been tracking this since 1977 and beyond, and half of them have happened from 2019 to 2021. And I say 21 because we haven't even inputted the information from the fire season of 22 yet, right? So I want to pause on one of these in particular, right? So we've said 5 million acres have burned throughout California since 2019 to 2021. We know that about 365,000 acres have burned so far in the 2022 fire season, right? And I just want to pop down to number 5 here, the Creek Fire. The Creek Fire burned at 379,000, right? That's as much as we've seen in the 22 season alone. I just always like to pause and really give her a little bit of a shout out as I currently live on the Creek Fire scar on the Sierra National Forest. And really it's part of the motivation of the work that we do. I feel like all Californians have a personal story at this point of what that looks like. And to also say, it's not just talking about something in the past. That was the 2020 fire that at the time was the largest. It was number 1 in 2020, and it's now number 5, right? That's not okay. And it doesn't stop there. Just 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, we had another fire here on the Creek Fire scar that actually burned 28 homes to the ground. So it's real. I just wanted to really get you guys grounded in the scale of the tragedy that is going on that is California before we move to what we're doing to be able to work with that. Next slide, please. So, as Brian noted, I am a forestry social scientist. I want to kind of walk you through, we've gone through the landscape for a minute, just want to walk you through what the change agents of California have been doing, right? At a government level, nonprofit, all parties at the table to be able to address the scale of this issue. So in 2015, the Tree Mortality Task Force was born, and that was really responsive, right? They're being responsive to 179 million trees that died across 10 counties. Those 10 counties happen to make up the Sierra Nevada, which provides 60% of the water to all Californians. So the takeaway here is that the Tree Mortality Task Force was built in a framework that most task forces are created, right? To be reactionary to a specific concern. And then as folks rolled up their hands, their sleeves and started to unpack those challenges, really realized it can't just be reactionary. We need to be thinking about this from a preventative standpoint, right? So that's where the Forest Management Task Force morphed into forest management that would then start to address the needs in and around thinning, strategic thinning, or prescribed burning as well. And then most recently, it just morphed one more time into the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. And this is because it truly brings to light the component of the WUI, right, or the wildland urban interface, or the people person, the people button, right? So those of us that are evacuating on a regular basis, what we can do in and around our homes, or being able to get in and out in a safe manner. So now, as you see in the bottom left, California Wildfire and Forest Resiliency Task Force created an action plan, the one in the middle, right, with over 100 actions to take now across boundary to be able to provide solutions at a scale and a time and a pace that matters, right? One of the working groups for those 100 tasks is the Reforestation Strategy Working Group, which American Forest has had the honor of facilitating, and really being able to dive in to go right back to where we started this morning, right? How do we be able to go from the moonscapes, right, or those lunar landscapes into lush forests? So next slide, please. The Reforestation Strategy Working Group really had to take a look at the entire pipeline, right? Just want to give you this context, this visual of what the reforestation pipeline is in our discussions today, right? It includes everything, whether that be cone collection, nursery capacity, planting the seed, taking that picture, or then actually having to do the work after to be able to make sure that they can be successful. Next slide, please. So the Reforestation Strategy Working Group of the task force was able to look at the entire pipeline, right? And has since birthed the Reforestation Pipeline Partnership. And this, I'd like to look at this a lot like an umbrella. So you have the Reforestation Pipeline Partnership that's truly, really, it's building off of this concept of shared stewardship, right? We know that these fires don't care about boundaries. So why are we, so many times compartmentalized into federal versus state versus private? And so this partnership does exactly that. It is a program of the Forest Service and CAL FIRE in order to work across lands to be able to do the key and critical reforestation work that's so desperately needed. Now, there's two components of this. One is, I'm doing an umbrella here, right? So here's the umbrella, and there's actually two handles on this nifty umbrella. One of them is knowing that we need to unpack some of these issues in that pipeline, right? We need to have some conversations, and we need to collaborate to be able to have increased efficiencies on the ground. That is the birth of the Reforestation Pipeline Cooperative. So that's a cooperative that goes throughout the state to be able to have those discussions. That second umbrella, we can't just talk about it, right? We need to do something about it now. And so that's actually the launch of a cone core that's going out to be able to start collecting, right? To be able to get out on the landscape and get that seed that we don't have enough of and is burning up nearly daily. So those are just a little teasers of some of the things that we're doing, right, in face of climate change and being able to go once again from those lunar landscapes to those lush forests. Next slide.
All right.
Great. Hey,
Over to you,
thanks,
Ryan.
Chris. Thanks, Britta. Mic check. Can you all hear me?
You sound good.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good afternoon and good morning. My name is Ryan Tompkins. I'm a cooperative extension forester with the University of California. I'm located in the Northern Sierra, and like Britta, I too have experienced wildfire for the past 6 years. I've seen 5 of them. I've seen wildfires from my front lawn, and 3 out of the 6 years they've been close enough to see flames. And so this is something that many of us are not only studying and working on as land stewards, but we're experiencing firsthand in our communities. I really appreciate Ryan's framing of and opening comments to frame the challenges here. While we oftentimes refer to this as a crisis, I really see it as a conundrum, because these dry mixed conifer forests of the West, wildfire is endemic to these systems, very frequent, low severity wildfire. And it's somewhat of a paradox that those of us who work in restoring these forests following high severity fire are also huge advocates for managing forests before they burn through either cutting trees and applying prescribed fire. But I think the other thing that's important to remember is that uncharacteristic high severity wildfire is merely a symptom of a far deeper rooted problem. And that's the alignment of drought with forest density. these dry forests after a decade of fire suppression are far too dense. And the only tools that we have to address this are by managing forests and by managing vegetation. So what we're seeing right now is really a pivot point where this sort of 20th century paradigm of conservation biology of protect and maintain really was a value system where we thought that management actions were riskier than doing nothing. And what we're seeing in this 21st century with climate exacerbated disturbances in these systems is that we're realizing that actually not managing these forests may be far riskier than managing them. Next slide, please. The popular press really likes to report fire size. And as we mentioned earlier, low to moderate severity fire has restorative and ecological process that these forests need. But perhaps what's most concerning to forest ecologists and forest managers is this increasing fire severity in these systems and the scale of high severity that we're seeing in this century. And so just to sort of give you an idea, historically under a natural fire regime, we would expect to see small patches of high severity fire on the order of 25 to 100 acres in size, depending on the forest type. What we're now seeing is high severity fire on the scale of thousands of acres in a continuous patch. And so let me give you an example from the Dixie Fire that burned in Plumas County last year. There were 4 patches of formerly forested land that burned greater than 10,000 acres in size, with the largest patch being over 30,000 acres in size, which is nearly 47 square miles. So we're really seeing these negative impacts across entire watersheds. As you can see here, this is an example from the 2007 Moonlight Fire. This is the Moonlight Creek drainage. And so this is a large challenge for forest managers simply because of our capacity to respond to disturbances this big. And this is resulting in the loss of forest cover across entire watersheds, which really result in very uncertain temporal legacies that include impacts to wildlife habitat and ecosystem services like water quality and water quantity delivery, as well as recreation and spiritual values that forests give to our society. Next slide, please. What's even more concerning is something that we're noticing in the Northern Sierra is that these high severity fire environments can actually create conditions that are vulnerable to burning yet again at high severity within a decade or two. These high severity environments are very dynamic in the first decade, wherein the first fire may have killed the trees, but it also created a plethora of large standing snags, dead trees, which eventually fall to the ground and become additional fuel load. Those dead trees are jackstrawed, growing in an arrangement with chest-high shrub fields that during extended fire seasons can become available to burn. And what we're seeing in our research is that, these high severity fire environments can have 60 to 100 tons per acre of large down wood, which are magnitudes greater than what we would expect in these systems under a natural fire regime. And so when these fires do burn or reburn, they end up killing naturally regenerating seedlings, as well as any remaining live trees, which were seed sources. Next slide, please. So here's what really is concerning to forest managers and forest ecologists in Western forests, is this propensity for high severity fire to initiate a positive feedback loop to create more high severity fire, which continually erodes forest cover. And this is how it happens. Initially, we know these forests are far too dense because of fire suppression and other past management practices. And so when they do burn, they typically burn with high severity, which is uncharacteristic for these systems. That's creating a fuel load that is uncharacteristic for these systems and how they operate. And so that creates the propensity to reburn again at high severity. So we're seeing this shift from forested systems to shrub-dominated systems. We call this ecological hysteresis, as you can see in the ball and cup model below, where we once had a stable community. If it shifts into an alternative steady state, sometimes the energy to get that community, that vegetative community back into its restored state takes a lot of energy. And that's where forest stewardship and collaboration across boundaries is particularly important. Next slide, please. So not only are these fires having impacts on ecological systems and communities, but they're also having increasing impact on human communities. This is a photo from the 2020 North Complex fire. This is a small family forest that is about 60 acres in size. As Britta had mentioned earlier, a third of California is covered in forest. Many people don't realize that, but California has extensive forests, and 27% are these small non-industrial private forest landowners as well as tribal lands. And these forests contribute to forest conservation in terms of wildlife habitat, ecosystem services. But what we're finding is these small non-industrial private forest landowners, when they're hit with catastrophic fires such as this, they oftentimes don't have the expertise or assets to respond. And so this is why delivering technical assistance and funding assistance to non-industrial private landowners is so important for a greater society that depends on forests for ecosystem values. And so that's where the challenges arise, because simply many forest management industries don't have the capacity to respond to events at this scale. Next slide, please. So I want to end on some hope, because while we know we have challenges in capacity of removing dead trees, of planting trees, of seed and cone sources like Britta had described, we're also developing partnerships and actually new creative novel ways of thinking how we restore these systems, which is really important because these systems require active management. This is an example of the 2019 Walker Fire reburn of plantations that were established after the 2007 Antelope Fire. And so we're starting to creatively think of how we reforest these areas with different densities of trees, different species of trees, and different arrangements of trees. But perhaps what's most critical in these environments is realizing that drought and fire will be often actors in these post-fire environments under this 21st century of climate exacerbated disturbance regimes. And so here we're trying to think creatively of how we plant trees and establish plantations that are synergistic and work with these disturbances rather than seeing this continual loss of forest. And with that, I will pass this back to Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan and Britta. That was very thought-provoking, and it brought up a couple questions for me. And maybe if you both could come back on camera, we can get a bit of a discussion going here for just a few minutes. Ryan, your presentation of that phase change between forests to other vegetation types and that ball and cup model, and your description about the energy that's required, right? Human energy, inputs, forest management activity to get that forest back. My question is really, if we don't do that, if we don't invest that energy, what's at stake for California? And I send this for, you know, for both of you to respond to, but maybe Ryan, if you can respond first.
Yeah, I think we should be thinking about these forests like sandcastles in the tidal zone. That, you know, these forests are adapted to wildfire and change, and every time the tide comes up, maybe some of the forest, you know, we experience some change, but it tends to regenerate itself. Now, what we're seeing though is when the tide comes up too fast and furious and too often, we have the potential to have continual erosion of forest cover. And so that means we need to start thinking strategically in this century of either how we shore that sandcastle up by building forests or managing forests so they're more resistant to these types of change, or building the sandcastle a little bit farther up the tidal zone where they're not experiencing these, where we're realigning them. And so I think I'm not offering one or the other. I think it's a mixture thereof of those types of solutions. But what's at stake is losing forested ecosystems in California.
And I'll just add on to that. I mean, to lose all those ecosystems around California, it's to lose everything, right? I mean, let's dig into that for a moment, right? Like, it's not just we lose the forest. I mean, this is public safety. This is public health, right? This is our watersheds, our air sheds, our food sheds, right? This is the backbone of the California economy, right? The 5th largest economy in the world. So to me, I'd almost reframe it of like, what's not at stake, right? I'm just trying to think, oh, how should I answer this? But it's everything. But I will just give one stat here, just so that, again, we can kind of understand the scale of the issue. Remember earlier, we were talking about the California ownership, and it was 27% was private landowners, right? Or tribal, just non-industrial private lands. Of that, right? So just of that, if we were to reforest today, just 25% of the need on those parts of the lands, it would take nearly 212 years at the current rate, right? That we are built. So that's why we're building the capacity, California's capacity, that pipeline to scale up, because that's not good enough. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Britta, your comments also make me think about my second question, which is around that capacity question, right? And California is an amazing place, right? As you said, 5th largest economy. A lot of our policy, especially, on climate policy, California is oftentimes the early leader. So given the shifts that you talked about with the Forest Management Task Force to the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force, and just kind of the evolving thinking in the state around how we invest in our forests and restore forests post-fire, just want to hear from you a little bit more about, like, from both of you, really, where do you see those collaborative partnerships forming in those new strategies, either coming through the state, through state funding and state policy, or just through, the hard work of people on the ground trying to address their local watershed? Like, what are you seeing in terms of these collaborative partnerships that are going to make for success in addressing this challenge?
How much time do we have? It's all on different scales, right? So you have the work that's being done on a place-based, localized level where there are actually shovels in the ground. But as you mentioned, there's also these like systematic fixes that are taking place in California state government and beyond right now to be able to address just that. I'm seeing here emerging public and private collaborative strategies. I want to go back to the RPP, or the Reforestation Pipeline Partnership. I think that this truly embodies the direction that we're all trying to go. We're trying to get the entire system to shift and go in a different direction. And I like to imagine it a bit like a quilt, right? You know, you may have federal land or state land or tribal land or private land, but if we all do our individual parts, but we're not actually the thread, right? We're not actually talking about it, then we all need seed, right? So it's not like, hey, this seed belongs here or belongs here. We don't get to control mechanisms like that. So being able to really diversify our system and our tools to be able to meet the needs at the speed that we need them is really what Homo sapiens are up against right now, right? We have to be able to do that. And just again, we talked about kind of this moment in time. You think about the money coming down right now. I mean, California really didn't even have the funds for this until 2018 was the first time, really, to be able to even start looking at this, right? And that was right before the 2019 fire season blew up that we talked about earlier. So while it's doom and gloom and everything's at cost or at stake, at the same moment, we've never had more resources, social will, political will to actually do this and to do it right. And so, yeah, I'm actually really excited about the resources at hand and what that means, because we can't do a Band-Aid fix anymore, right? There's no like, oh, well, here's a grant, let's go for it and see if we can do something in 5 years. We're now having mechanisms put into place to actually be able to get funding and be able to move through environmental compliance quickly, to actually get on the landscape right after a fire occurred. So we're working out those kinks, and those kinks only work if you have buy-in, and buy-in only works if you actually have those public-private collaborative strategies. So we're doing a lot of hosting difficult discussions and convening and really being able to decide collectively what we want our future forests to look like.
Excellent. So a time of innovation, a time of consequence. Ryan.
Yeah, I agree with Britta that the scale that she communicated is mind-boggling. And I think, you know, while we were very focused on responding to wildfires as fire incidents, this idea of developing a larger industry to really address restoration of forests has lagged a little bit. And in order to really kickstart that, these public-private partnerships are so important. If you think about it, much of the technical expertise and capability for growing forests lies in those private industrial forest companies and landowners who have a vested interest in keeping forest land forested in California. And I think we're seeing way more awareness that administrative boundaries are simply lines drawn on maps, and that working across those boundaries is completely essential to providing solutions at scale. And that too benefits the non-industrial and tribal forests that are also being affected. And I think that those partners are bringing a diversity of perspective and also corporate knowledge from their land holdings or traditional ecological knowledge from their lands that also inform the efforts with greater perspective and diversity. And that sort of diversity is what's going to be the strength behind the solution. So this isn't a silver bullet type of solution. This is a need for a mutual sort of a mutual fund portfolio approach where we balance risk and reward, and we try multiple things. So that's or multiple strategies and tactics, which is sort of really inspiring when you think of the creativity that this space allows for.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you both for your talks, and don't go anywhere because we're going to hopefully circle back and bring you into our broader panel discussion at the end of this. But I think you've just really laid out nicely how how you're thinking about the scalar issues and challenges and the solutions. And so what I want to do next is shift a little bit north up to my home state of Oregon and pull in Amy Marcus with the Fremont Wainema National Forests. And Amy and I are going to talk through a local example of how partnership is forming to recover one of these landscapes that has been really, really hit hard by high severity wildfire. So next slide, please. I'm going to start off just by providing a little bit of context for the work that's taking place and start off with a discussion about what's occurred in South Central Oregon. So since 2018, in Klamath and Lake counties, we've had about 650,000 acres of burn in recent wildfires. Again, this is in a dry forest ecosystem. This is a system that requires wildfire as part of its natural ecology. But what we're seeing increasingly is that when the fire has come in, it is not the type of fire that that we want to see in this ecosystem. So the map here on the right is from an assessment that our colleague Libby Pansing, who's a restoration scientist here at American Forest, prepared for this work. And what the map is showing is about across that 650,000 acres, 66% of the fire occurred as high severity fire. So these are areas where most, if not all, of the trees were killed in the fire. Those are the areas displayed in red. And the areas in green are areas where the fire actually had beneficial effects. And this could be for any number of reasons, but it's something that we want to maintain. So that is something that is feeding into a broader all lands, all jurisdiction strategy about how to reintroduce fire in the future into this landscape that has been heavily impacted by high severity fire. One thing I want to point out here, the bootleg fire, which you can see in the map on the left, that burned in July into August in 2021. So just over a year ago. It was about 413,000 acres, high severity fire in many places. In fact, the largest patch within bootleg is about 4 times the size of the island of Manhattan, which is just really unfathomable. So what to do about that? Next slide, please. So coming out of that realization, the people in Klamath and Lake counties that are doing forest restoration day in and day out came together, and it was actually quite inspiring for me to see. And the Forest Service, Amy's agency, together with 2 large private timber companies, the Nature Conservancy, who's also a landowner in the area, and the Klamath tribes, who has most of their ancestral lands across all these other jurisdictions at the present time, along with the Oregon Department of Forestry, who represents the small family forest lands that are about 5,000 individuals. So a large contingent of stakeholders came together and said, we want to reestablish a forest ecosystem on this landscape in these highly affected lands. And not just a forest ecosystem, not just planting seedlings, but doing so in a way that allows us to reintroduce prescribed fire as a predominant management and maintenance tool going forward. So it really forced a development of a strategy that was intentional in how we were thinking about recovering and restoring not just the forest, but the ecological process of low severity fire back into that forest. Next slide, please. So in addition to that vision, a set of shared goals were developed by that core team of partners, protecting the remaining green forest that exists in that landscape, maintaining it through prescribed fire and additional ecological thinning where necessary, really building up the capacity for climate adapted reforestation treatments to avoid forest conversion into shrub habitat that Ryan talked about. mitigating the future risk of high severity fire. So getting out of that vicious cycle of high severity fire begetting high severity fire. So dealing with the fact that, as shown in this picture here, we still have a lot of fuel left on that landscape. And then really advancing a partnership that is leveraging each other's resources, expertise, and interdependencies to scale up the work, to scale up the workforce, to scale up the seed collection, to scale up the work on the ground. I just want to pause here for a minute too on the climate adapted reforestation. You know, American Forest, this is something that it's a major focus of our organization. It is something that we're bringing in the science and the thinking about, you know, how do we actually plant trees and tend them over the long term to ensure that we have a forest that's going to be resilient to climate change. So in this landscape, we've really thought about that challenge at 3 scales, both at the landscape scale, the site or project scale, and or temporally, right? So thinking about taking advantage of weather windows or climate windows in the future to get in there and do some planting in a relatively moist period in a landscape that is going through extensive drought. So at the site or project level, we're looking at seed sources. So thinking about taking seed from dry sites and planting those in more moist or productive sites, allowing for those sites to, you know, transition to being drier sites in the future, right? So thinking about the effects of climate change and adapting how we're doing planting and reforestation based on that. Ryan also touched on density. We're thinking a lot about what type of density will be most resilient in the future, looking at planting individual trees or clumps of trees together that may facilitate their better use of water together, thinking about all these questions, and also, like I said earlier, doing so within a way that will facilitate the reintroduction of prescribed fire into those young forests that are recovering. So above all else though, this strategy really has a strong fuel management, fuel reduction emphasis, given the amount of fuel that's left on the landscape following these high severity fires. Next slide, please. So the strategy that's been developed has really been anchored in a post-fire restoration assessment of this landscape. So of the 650,000 acres, we've determined that restoration actions are needed on about 577,000 acres. And we've broken these up into a set of activities. So reducing the fuel loading, doing the climate adapted planting. Those activities are very, very significant in the strategy. We're also looking at areas that could just be maintained based on the beneficial effects of the fire, so that when we want to do a large prescribed fire in the future, we can do so in areas that are both recently burned at high severity and those areas that are still green. So thinking about these larger maintenance treatments with prescribed fire in the future. The Klamath tribes in particular have really focused on the meadow systems and the meadow complexes within this landscape. Those are areas that are culturally important in terms of living culture resources, like special plants important to the cultures of the Klamath tribes, but then also significantly important in the future based on water retention. So these are areas that are generally wet, and where having trees is not ideal, right? So we're being intentional about building into the strategy, both places that we want to do reforestation and places that we don't. Obviously, 577,000 acres is massive, and it's going to be costly. So our tally is that this will be collectively about $650 million of investment needed to stand this landscape back up. That's going to happen over decades. Next slide, please. So I want to turn it over now to Amy to provide some reflections about her work in this landscape and the challenges and opportunities ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. Well, hi, I'm Amy Marcus. I'm the Cohesive Strategy Coordinator for the Fremont-Wainema National Forest. And in this position, I'm really fortunate to be able to work with a lot of really incredible partners to do landscape level cross-boundary restoration. And so I oversee our collaborative forest landscape restoration program, our Joint Chiefs program, our Good Neighbor Authority projects. And now our partnership is talking a lot about how we can apply the concepts that we apply to our pre-fire wildfire risk reduction landscapes to our post-fire landscapes. Next slide, please. So in 2021, the fire season in Klamath and Lake counties was unprecedented. We had 515,000 acres that burned. We had extreme dry weather. We had extended high temperatures and really low relative humidity that resulted in large, high severity, fast moving wildfires. The bootleg fire was the largest fire that we've had in South Central Oregon. That was 427,000 acres. And right next to the bootleg fire, we had the Cougar Peak fire, and it burned. It was extremely fast moving, and it burned to 90,000 acres in just 2 days. So weather and wildfire behavior is definitely changing. In all honesty, these fires have been really hard on our local communities. We're a very rural area, and our local communities are really highly dependent on our forested landscapes for recreational value, for timber production, for wildlife habitat, and grazing. We have some of our communities that have been impacted by multiple fires in the last couple of years and have actually had to evacuate more than once. I think for me, the hardest part for me, and this is probably because I'm actually a wildlife biologist, is the extensive loss of large old ponderosa pine. It took centuries for those trees to grow as large as they are, and it's going to take centuries to get them back. So within the Forest Service and our partners, there's a lot of discussion about the need to increase pace and scale of restoration. This is a term that's used really commonly, but this is normally applied to needing to increase the pace and scale of restoration to do pre-fire risk reduction projects through treatments like thinning and prescribed fire. Well, additive to this, we now have a critical need to increase the pace and scale of reforestation to regrow the forests that we have lost in these wildfires. The unfortunate reality in this is that the cost of post-fire reforestation and all the activities that go along with that, along with the cost of the fire suppression, it's just a huge price tag. And had we been able to do all of the thinning and prescribed fire within these landscapes before they burned, we estimate that we could have saved about $120 million. Next slide, please. So here locally, we are really fortunate to have a strong all lands partnership, the Klamath Lake Forest Health Partnership, where we're really working hard to reduce the risk of wildfire. And we've been really successful in treating both public and private lands at scales that are meaningful. We're engaging and providing technical assistance to private landowners. We're getting outside funding to do work on the ground, and we're really staying focused on implementing restoration on the ground to reduce the risk of wildfires. So with all this work that we're doing, as soon as the fires, the bootleg fire and the Cougar Peak fire started slowing down in 2021, immediately our partnership started talking about how can we apply these same concepts to our post-fire landscapes, the concepts of working all lands through shared stewardship. And this is why we reached out to American Forests and asked them to help us out by developing a strategy that is all lands and involves all the partnerships that are involved in these landscapes. In that strategy, we've identified several thousand non-industrial private landowners that need to reforest. Reforestation is definitely not an easy thing for most landowners to navigate. And so they really need technical support and funding. And so we're working towards trying to make that available to our non-industrial private landowners. Now, you heard from our previous panel members that if we don't reforest, there's going to be a large scale conversion to non-forest. I think this is a critical issue within the Forest Service right now, and it really needs a lot of attention because this is very real. This is actually something that our forest and our partnership, we were concerned about this before we had the Cougar and Bootleg fires in 2021. And now we've got 550,000 acres of wildfire that are additive to the previous wildfires that we've had. So thankfully, this topic, it is, and this is a positive in this whole topic, is we are starting to see a lot of attention to this at the national level. There's the recent executive order that President Biden just signed, the Replant Act, and the National Reforestation Strategy, and all the funding sources that are becoming available. But I would say that putting reforestation into practice and at large scales, that's not really happening yet. And that's the challenge that we really need to tackle, and one that our partnership is talking a lot about right now. When you're talking about reforestation at large scales, oh, next slide, please. So when we're talking about reforestation at large scales, this is a huge program. When I talk to people, I try to explain that this is comparable to our timber program or our fuels program in terms of the size and scale of the reforestation that's needed, and the complexity and the staffing that's needed to get that done. Unfortunately, within the Forest Service, a lot of our really good on the ground practical experience has retired. We honestly don't have very many people left in the Forest Service that are really good at knowing all the ins and outs of reforestation. And so training and mentoring is really going to be critical. So it's definitely going to take us a few years to grow a program to get to where we can actually scale up our reforestation program. And I would say too, it's important to know that with climate change and drought, conditions have changed, and reforestation today, it's not the same as it was 20 years ago. Generally, we're planting in drier conditions, our windows are shorter, and like Ryan was talking about earlier, the potential for reburn, I think it's much higher today than it was years ago with the recent changes in weather patterns and fire behavior. So it's really important that we not just plant trees, but we also address competing vegetation, and that we reduce the fuels within the areas we plant and around the areas that we plant. So those trees can grow, and they can grow big and tall as quick as possible, so that they're going to be resilient to fire down the road, whether that's prescribed fire or wildfire. So I'll end with a couple of things. I think our biggest challenge that we're facing is funding, capacity, and the training needs. I'm definitely hopeful that the funding is going to come with the recent legislation that's been passed and the partnerships that are being formed and our ability to leverage funding. But I think a bigger challenge might be the need for capacity, both within the Forest Service and with our partners to provide the support to the non-industrial private landowners, and then to get the work done on Forest Service land. One really neat thing, and it just shows the power of partnerships, in our workings with American Forests is we've been able to enter into an agreement with American Forests, and they have hired, they have funding to hire 3 to 4 seasonal employees to help us implement our reforestation program. So they're going to be integrating with Forest Service staff, working to get implementation of reforestation and everything associated with reforestation done on the ground. So that's a pretty neat thing. And I'll just end by saying that I really, what it comes down to for me is that partnerships will be the key to overcoming our challenges and for finding solutions for scaling up our reforestation program.
Wonderful, thank you, Amy. So I want to transition to a Q&A, and I've got a couple questions for you, Amy, but I also, there was one that came in through the Q&A that I want to address, and you just touched on this a second ago, Amy. So I want to look to you and Ryan to respond to this. Do we have specific examples where reburns have come in, a second fire has come in to a previously burned landscape at a significant scale? And you can define that significant scale however you want, but is this phenomenon currently happening, and maybe point to a couple places where it has?
So Ryan can probably answer this a little bit better than I can, but we do have one example of a fire that burned in 2018, and the bootleg fire burned up to the Watson Creek fire, which was in 2018. And although we didn't see significant acres burn in that older fire, the 2018 fire, the Watson Creek fire did not give us the ability to hold the bootleg fire. It was not effective at holding the bootleg fire. We did see the bootleg fire burning into the Watson Creek fire, and it wasn't effective as a place to hold the fire. So, I mean, not only are we getting reburns within our previous wildfires, but they're no longer effective at holding a fire like they were in the past.
Yeah, I really want to sort of reiterate what Amy just said is 20 years ago, a 60,000 acre fire was what people would consider as a big fire, or what they would call as a career fire, right? Thinking you'd never see that kind of fire in your career.
I remember when a 3,000 acre fire was a big fire.
Yeah,
really.
That's right. That's right. And so now we're seeing fires, if you recall Britta's table, up to 1 million acres in size, or nearly 1 million acres in size. And so it's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't have like one answer of so many acres have reburned, but we're seeing this over and over again. And perhaps California might be a little bit of the canary in the coal mine, because we first saw this, or it was first well documented on the 2000 Story fire when it reburned in 2012 from the Chips fire. That's where some ecologists wrote some papers that were really detailing this effect in a quantitative measure. Brandon Collins and Scott Stevens have done a paper showing that these fires have about 9 to 10 years of buffering future fires where they actually mitigate the fire behavior. But after that, in these dynamic systems, the fuel profiles over time grow and deposit dead material so much that they're becoming vulnerable to reburn. So in those past fires, like Amy said, those past like 3,000 acre and these small fires, we used to actually use it was very common to use old fires as a management tactic to box in fire that's burning. But what we're finding in these older fires is that they're now more vulnerable to burning. And so the Chips Story is a great example. In 2019, the picture that I showed of the antelope, or the Walker Fire burned the 2007 antelope complex. The 2021 Dixie Fire burned through both the Moonlight Fire as well as some other older fires like the Chips Fire. And so we're seeing this as a recurring theme in these contemporary fires now. And so it's something that forest stewards and land managers are really starting to have on their radar as a management concern.
And I keep coming back to that image, Ryan, that you gave for all of us of the sandcastle, right? That, you know, it's eroding, it's being rebuilt, and you know that is a place that these forests and these burn landscapes are going to be, they're going to be like that sandcastle over time and require continued stewardship and management if we're going to have forests there in the future. So I want to sort of open it up here. We're getting towards the end of our time. And I've got a couple questions for you, Amy. We also have a couple questions that I want to pose to all three of you. And I'm going to do a little bit of an audible and ask a question about where does all this work stack up? I talked at the beginning about the 55 million acres of forest in the Western United States that are really challenged in terms of their forest health and resilience, that really require some type of intervention, either, you know, thinning treatments or prescribed fire, or both oftentimes. So how do we stack up the need for increasing the post-fire restoration program and work, like you talked about, Amy, just alongside all of this other work that needs to happen? And what can we do to break down some of those silos that currently exist within our land management agencies, within our policies, within our regulatory environment, that are going to make it challenging to do that? So that's kind of a big question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on how this post-fire work stacks up with all the other important restoration work we need to be doing. I can see Britta wants to jump in.
Oh, go ahead, Britta.
I was just smiling at the big question at hand. Is this not the answer we would all like to? Do we have the recipe? How can we just do this and do it well the first time? Yes. Unfortunately, it is complex, but I think for me, the first thing that comes up actually goes back to a common theme throughout this presentation, and that's the power of partnerships. There's so many P's here, right? The power of those public-private partnerships, so the PPPP. No, I'm going to stop that. But and I'll just give one example. So, you know, and it has to do with scale, right? So we know that there are 5 million acres in California that need to be restored, right? About 5 million that burned, and about 1.5 million that need to be reforested, right? Well, when we look at so each little bit is its own little conundrum, right? So just from the seed collection standpoint, we already talked about some of the numbers that are challenging around that, but we had said that 76,000 bushels were needed just to do 25% of the non-industrial lands. In the last 4 years, the state seed bank has been able to collect approximately 1,400 bushels, right? That's about 350 bushels a year, right? When we've needed the 76,000. But this year alone, just in the last 8 weeks, with the power of public-private partnership, we've doubled that. In the last 6 weeks, we've collected nearly 700 bushels of cone. And that's directly because of the power of public-private partnerships. So we need to we can get really overwhelmed by, how could we do this? But we got to start with seed. Let's get seed. Let's start doing it, right? We just got to piecemeal it so that we don't get overwhelmed by the scale of the climate grief associated with it. So, but that's literally, we've doubled it in our first round of even giving it a go. And that's because everybody's at the table and there's a sense of urgency. So that's my take on your big, simple question there.
Thank you. No, and I think you teed something up that I just want to quickly say is one of those seed collection efforts, right, was, in a landscape that was threatened by the mosquito fire and, you know, the largest fire in California this year. And, you know, we were able to get in there as, you know, American Forest and support the collection of some really rare disease-resistant sugar pine cones that will be really important to restoring that landscape in the future. So we have a campaign going on right now, Seed September at American Forest. So we're really excited about this issue. And we actually, you know, like to remind folks that that is sort of the beginning of that pipeline and reforestation. It all starts with seed. We can't do any of this without it. And we've mentioned the word crisis with regards to climate, with regards to wildfire. We are in a seed crisis in many places in this country. So just something to note. We had one other question come in the chat, and I think I want to, while we're on the topic of California, bring this up. We talked a lot about the federal policy and the new funding. How is the state of California aligning its funding with the federal funding to support this work?
Okay, I'll speak up just to say that over the last decade, the state of California has really stepped up in terms of recognizing the challenges and also recognizing that the issue runs across public and private lands and taking an all lands approach. What is really exciting is the state of California has invested not only in the preventative restoration that we need, so you know, thinning, prescribed fire, and there's a shared stewardship agreement between the U.S. Forest Service and the state of California to try to treat 1 million acres a year to do that preventative restoration work that is much needed in the state. But in addition to that, the state is getting ready to invest $100 million in reforestation over the next 2 years, which will also cover public and private support. And those are just a few examples of the investments and the scale of the investments that the state is willing to do. And that is all based and predicated on the strategies that are coming out of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force that not only looks at reforestation, but looks at a diversity of topics that are very broad across the forest management industry, including small landowners and wood products and prescribed fire. And so that's really exciting for many of us in forest management in California right now.
Thanks, Ryan. I want to give the last word to Amy. It's very easy in a conversation between Oregon and California for Oregon to get a little bit overshadowed by California. As an Oregonian, I can say that. So Amy, when we're thinking about the state of Oregon and the National Forest System, we talked about, you mentioned the Replant Act, right? So this is a significant policy to support this work at the federal level. I wonder if you could just touch for a minute on how your forest is thinking about the Replant Act and its application to the strategy that we talked about.
Well, I think it just comes down to that we're going to try to get ourselves organized as a forest and through partnerships to get the capacity we need to get reforestation accomplished, and then position ourselves to be able to utilize the Replant Act in terms of the funding that's going to become available. But to get there, you know, there's a lot of work we need to do before we can take advantage of those funds, like getting the seed that we need, getting the capacity we need, building the partnerships. So we're really focused on that right now.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the end of our panel, and I want to thank Amy, Ryan, and Britta for your time and your ideas and your commitment to these issues and the hard work that you guys are all doing in your places on the ground. I also want to thank everybody that participated with us over the course of this discussion. And I just want to mention too that this discussion does not end here. You can actually go scan this QR code with your phone. We all have these smartphones these days, so you can use it and scan that code. And that's going to take you to some additional resources of American forests about our wildfire efforts and our National Wildfire Media Hub. So a lot of new information available there. The strategies that we talked about, the post-fire reforestation strategy for California, eventually, I'm sure we'll have that up there, as well as the all lands integrated post-fire resilience strategy for South Central Oregon. We will definitely have that up there on that website as well. So please join our social media platforms as well. We talk about these issues every day. We're doing a lot of hard work, from the policy work in DC that we're doing down to these partnerships in the field. So we love to tell that story. We love to engage people in this work. And just a final note, we will be posting this recording on our YouTube channel later this week. So feel free to check it out and pass it along. So thank you so much for your time and interest, and have a great week.